I grew up in Ohio in the 70s, and me and my childhood friend Joe were outside all the time. Joe lived on a farm that bordered a pretty big forest, and my parents would drop me off in the morning, and we'd stay in the woods all weekend. We'd only come out for school. We loved pretending we were frontiersmen. We'd build shelters, traps, practice making fire with sticks, the whole 9 yards. When we got to be in high school, we got this notion to pull a Stand By Me. This was based on the movie of the same name that had just come out. The idea was that we'd walk the railroad tracks out in the country, but instead of looking for someone, we'd find cool bridges to fish from and camp a little ways off the tracks. Of course, we knew this was dangerous and we'd likely be trespassing, but we were kids. We had a lot of fun. We did find beautiful rivers. We discovered bridges no one went to. We fished. We hid from trains. At night, we camped in woods just near the tracks and made small hidden fires. Nothing bad ever happened. It was idyllic. In fact, it was so fun we did it multiple times. Never had a problem. After high school, me and Joe went our own ways. We both left home, but always stayed in touch and always tried to coordinate visits so we'd see each other occasionally. Well, one summer in the mid-90s, it worked out that we were both in town for about a week. We'd do stuff with family in the day, and at night we'd either catch drinks at a bar or sit outside Joe's house around a fire and talk about the old days. One night, me and Joe got to talking about our Stand By Me trips. Well, nostalgia and beer are a hell of a mix. Soon we decided to take a day, walk the rails, camp one night, and walk home. The day came, we started out early morning. We had my wife drop us off in our old spot, where we used to start, right outside our hometown. She thought this was absolutely crazy, and made sure to mention it. When she pulled away, Joe suggested that instead of walking the usual route, we'd take the opposite direction, just to be adventurous. We knew the land well, we had a map, so I gave a, "What the hell," and off we set. The day went fine. It was fun and a little sad, but in a good way. We found a bridge and sat on the edge, smoked a joint, and moved on. We had no fishing gear, but we brought some canned food and other stuff. Before night started to set in, we picked a spot to camp. It was a thick forested area, trees on every side of the train tracks, so you felt like you were in a tunnel. We had brought small hammocks to sleep on, but before we set them up, we decided to do a little scouting of the perimeter. Now this is what we used to do in the old days too. We'd walk the area around a little bit to make sure some dude's house wasn't just over a hill. We walked maybe 100 or so feet into the woods and up a small incline. We figured if we didn't see anything from on top of this short hill, we'd be fine. But when we got to the top, we saw an old building down at the bottom, about 100 yards into the woods. It was barely visible. We pondered over what to do. We both assumed it was a sugar shack or something because there didn't appear to be a clear road into it. From where we were, there didn't look to be anyone in it either. All was quiet, no movement could be seen, no lights. We decided to walk a little closer just to make sure. We came down the hill very slowly, and as we neared the building, we saw it wasn't a sugar shack at all. It was an old church. It looked like it had been abandoned for years. It was a squat, sagging building whose wooden planks were almost black from years of moss and rot. A cross still stood on top of the place, also weathered black. None of the windows had glass, and there were no doors, just open doorways. We got close enough to see inside. There were rows of pews and a built-up section in front for a preacher to stand. We didn't go all the way in, we didn't want to. Beyond all that, there was no sign of anyone else. No footprints, no paths, no roads. It was an abandoned church. We left immediately and went back up the hill to our spot we had picked to camp. Having a hill between us and the church made us feel better, but we were still a little uneasy. We chalked it up to the natural creepiness seeing a church in the middle of the woods would elicit. Besides, at this point it was dusk, and we just decided to rig up our hammocks and go to sleep and move on at early morning. Night set in, and as we lay in our hammocks and shot the shit, we began to hear something in the direction of the church. Our conversation about it went a little like this. "Do you hear that? What the fuck is that? It sounds like people singing." And it did sound just like singing. We both slid right out of our hammocks and hunkered down, straining to hear more. We listened for a minute or two, and the singing continued, but it wasn't getting louder. Finally, we decided to creep back up the hill and see if we could spy where the sound was coming from. We could still move very quietly in the woods from the old days. It was second nature to us. The moon was barely out, but it provided enough light so you wouldn't walk right into a tree, but it was near pitch black. We didn't use flashlights as we crept slowly up the hill, and we didn't talk. When we got to the top, we saw light in the distance. It was coming from the church, and the singing was coming from inside. Joe and I put our heads close together and had a hushed conversation that boiled down to, "Can you believe this shit?" The light looked to be candlelight from the way it flickered, and though we tried, we couldn't make out what was being sung. It sounded like church music, but in another language. We sat and watched for a while, trying to see who was in there, but we only saw occasional shadows. We had no intention of getting closer either. We had about a football field length between us, and we aimed to keep it that way. The singing continued for a bit, and then it stopped. After that, a booming male voice began to chant. I was already freaked out, but this voice thoroughly scared the shit out of me. It sounded like some Old Testament preacher you see in movies, but again, it was like he was speaking in a different language because we couldn't understand a single word. Eventually it got to where the single male voice would say something, and then a bunch of voices would answer in song. This lasted for a while, and then they all broke into this long, sustained wail that just kept getting louder. It got so loud and so disturbing that I covered my ears. Then it stopped. At this point, I was just getting ready to say, "Let's get the fuck out of here," when Joe put a hand on my shoulder and hissed, "They're coming out!" We were far enough away that we couldn't make them out really well, but what we could see was a line of figures walk out the open doorway, all holding hands in single file. We could see some of them had flashlights. They began to sing again, and the light from the flashlights began to move toward us and the hill. We booked it back down to our campsite, grabbed our shit and ran to the tracks. Once there, we ran down the tracks in the direction we had come from. After a few minutes, we stopped and looked back. We saw lights coming down the hill. They were moving erratically, like whoever was holding them was shaking them. We continued to run in spurts and walk as fast as we could. We eventually stopped seeing the lights and came to a road. By our map, we knew a small town was about 15 minutes down it, and we walked there, got to a 24-hour gas station, and called my wife to come get us. My wife and other friends all just thought it was kids messing around, but I heard those voices, and they sure as hell didn't sound like kids to me. Not sure who those people were, but it was definitely the creepiest thing that has happened to me out in the woods. So it's the summer of 2013, I'm 21, and just finished my junior year in college. The second week of August, a group of my friends and I go on an 8-day camping trip. It's 7 of us in total, 4 guys and 3 girls. We're camping in a semi-remote campground in the White Mountains of New Hampshire. It was a large campground, but very few other campers were there. There were a few filled sites near the front of the campground, but we purposefully requested a site off in the back corner. We were completely by ourselves. During the trip, we planned a whitewater rafting trip for one of the days. We were hiking Mount Washington towards the end of the trip and thought maybe we'd do 1 to 2 other small hikes, with 1 to 2 days of just chilling by the lake at the campground. We also planned on doing plenty of drinking during the evenings. The first couple days of the trip are fantastic. Whitewater rafting was a blast. Everything is going great. So it's the evening of our 3rd day. We have a roaring fire going. We're all just hanging out at the campsite, drinking and messing around. It's around 9:30 when a disheveled-looking man walks past our site. His clothes are kind of torn, worn out, messy, tangled hair, etc., and he looks maybe in his mid-40s. This isn't weird, though. We all just think it's another camper doing a late evening stroll around the campground. About an hour and a half later, we see this same man walk past our site in the same direction. This time he is walking slower, almost with a bit of a limp. We're all pretty drunk at this point. I think one of us might have yelled something out to him, but he just ignores us and keeps walking. Mildly strange, but still is probably just someone who wanted to take a long walk. We wrap up the night at around 1:32. The fire is dying down and we head back to our tents. I usually love sleeping while camping. I usually find it extremely peaceful, but for some reason, I was having trouble sleeping this night. I get up to take a piss in the woods, and when I do, I see a faint light, maybe about 50 to 75 yards ahead of me in the woods. It looks like a dim flashlight or something similar. I decide I want to investigate. I go back to the tent. One of my other buddies is still awake, so I tell him about it. We get up to investigate, and when we do, the light is no longer on. Feeling a little unnerved, I shine my flashlight around the woods a bit, but don't see anything, so I decide maybe my eyes were playing a trick on me before, and I head back to bed. Sometime later that night, I wake up to a terrifying scream. It was Sarah. She was one of the girls we were camping with. I jump out of my tent as quickly as possible and nearly run into her as she's running back into our site, still screaming. She screams that there was a man standing in the middle of the woods. Now our whole party is awake and freaking out. I try to calm Sarah down enough to get her to explain what actually happened. She says she went to pee in the woods and saw the man from earlier just standing about 15 feet from her, not moving like a statue. We're all freaking out, yelling, screaming, making a giant commotion. I'm internally freaking out too, but try to calm everyone down enough so we can actually do something. We obviously decide to get the hell out of there. We frantically take down our tents, basically just ripping the poles out and throwing everything into the back of our cars. Then we sped out of there. It's around 4 a.m., we're in 2 separate cars, and decide to just drive away from the campsite and try to clear our heads. Eventually, at around 5:30, we find a small diner that's open and decide to head in for some breakfast. We all have different theories about what the hell just happened. Some of us think we just ran into a homeless guy who was camping out in the woods and was surprised by us. Some of the girls think maybe he was purposefully stalking us. Either way, obviously none of us are comfortable staying at that campground again. I head back to the front desk of the campground with 2 of the other guys. We explain what happened, and the guys at the front desk actually seemed to believe us, but said there was definitely no other campers currently that fit the description of the guy. They were insanely nice about it though, and actually refunded most of the remainder of our stay, which astonished me. As a group, we decided that, fuck it, we weren't letting one freaky guy ruin our trip. We find another campground a good ways away to stay in. Fast forward 2 days, we're hiking Mount Washington. We get up real early and get the mountain at around 7:30 to start hiking up. We're a little over halfway up the mountain when we see the very same guy hiking down. Though this time he looks much better. His hair isn't crazy. His hiking clothes are relatively clean. We're all just frozen. A few of us let out a surprised scream. He just strolls past us with this massive grin. Luckily, there are enough hikers nearby that nothing could really happen. We decide to continue hiking up anyways, since he is headed in the opposite direction, and hope we just never encounter him again. We did finish the hike, and luckily didn't see him. After that, we did decide to cut the trip a couple of days short. Looking back on it, we've all come to the conclusion we were likely being stalked in some way. If it was just some homeless guy in the woods near the campground, what the hell is he doing hiking down Mount Washington a couple days later? It was a pretty unnerving and bizarre experience for sure. A buddy and I went hunting over a long weekend a few years ago. We hiked into our hunting terrain and stayed in a tent. This was in the middle of nowhere in the Norwegian wilderness, and we had exclusive hunting rights to the area, so we didn't really expect any other people to be there. No cell service within something like a 5 to 6 kilometer radius, and something like 10 kilometers to our cars. We were camped next to a small lake and didn't see any other people there for the first couple of days. On our last night there, we were eating dinner next to our campfire pretty late at night, so everything outside our immediate surroundings was pitch black. Suddenly, we heard someone take a shot on the other side of the lake with what sounded like a rifle. We thought it was a bit strange since there shouldn't have been any other hunters anywhere close by, but we just figured someone was messing around further away than it sounded like. We forgot about it and settled back in to eat. After another 5 to 10 minutes, someone took a second shot, which sounded like it came from much closer to us. This time, the bullet hit some rocks right next to us, like 5 meters or so. We both sort of froze for a few seconds while looking at each other, and then just ran to our tent to pick up our shotguns. We then ran quite a ways into the woods and just hunkered down. After a few minutes, we heard another shot, and were pretty sure it hit our tent, which later turned out to be correct. We obviously had no idea of what to do, and we couldn't call the cops since there was no cell service. It was completely dark, so we couldn't really hike out of there without using flashlights, which seemed like a terrible idea. We ended up finding a downed tree with a little cave-like thing under the roots, and just sat there until morning. We then packed up as quickly as possible and basically ran back to our cars, where we called the cops. The cops took it pretty seriously, it seemed like, but nothing ever came out of the investigation. Still have no idea what happened or who could possibly have done it. There was absolutely no reason for anyone to be out there with a gun, unless they were poachers, which is almost unheard of in Norway. I've never been so scared in my life, and it definitely took a few years before we went back.